Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Maria Montague. I'm the Deputy Director of the Ukrainian Institute London, a centre for broadening knowledge on Ukraine in the UK and beyond through educational and cultural activities. The Institute is a registered charity, and we are solely funded by ticket sales and donations. And we're really pleased that this evening's webinar is free because we wanted to make sure that it was accessible to everyone. And for those of you who are able to, we would be very grateful for your donations. This evening's event is organized in partnership with the Temeti Contemporary Ukraine program at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. And the webinar will be moderated by Dr. Olesya Khromeychuk, the director of the Ukrainian Institute London. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Olesya is a historian and writer. She has taught the history of East Central Europe at the University of Cambridge, UCL, the University of East Anglia, and King's College London. Olesya's current research focuses on the participation of women in military formations during the Second World War and in the ongoing conflict in the Donbas region of Ukraine. She has published on the participation of women in the Maidan protests of 2013 to 14, and she is the guest editor of Gender, Nationalism and Citizenship in Anti-Authoritarian Protests in Belarus, Russia and Ukraine, a special issue of the Journal of Soviet and Post-Soviet Politics and Society. Olesya is going to introduce our speakers this evening, so I will hand over to you, Olesya.
Thank you so much, Maria. I am very pleased to have the chance to moderate this webinar. The speakers are scholars whose work I really admire, and the topic is very close to my own research. In the 3 decades of Ukraine's independence, women have been active participants of all social and political changes. In the recent years, we have seen their active participation in the Maidan protests, of course, in the military conflict in eastern Ukraine, in human rights activism. Their numbers in the parliament have increased. Their voices are certainly more audible, and at least some women have gained more visibility. Yet there are still huge challenges that women face in Ukraine as all over the world. The pandemic all over the world showed an increase in domestic violence, and most victims are women. In Ukraine, the cases doubled. Indeed, the theme of today's Women's March in Kyiv was the female face of the pandemic, and one of our speakers attended the march, so she'll be able to tell us more about it. Now, before I introduce the speakers, which I'll do in a moment, I'd like to begin by explaining a little bit why this topic is so important to me. As someone who teaches history, I find myself regularly facing the challenge of both finding the texts that speak of women's experiences in history, but also finding texts written by women scholars. I make it a priority to include both of these types of texts in my teaching materials because experiences of women are experiences of at least 50% of the population. And if we do not study them and we do not talk about them, we will not have a complete picture or at least more complete picture of events that we study. And work written by women scholars allows students to understand that a historian is anyone who has the skills and qualifications to conduct historical research, regardless of their age, their gender, skin color, social background, and so on. I have witnessed how the presence of role models has encouraged students to enter those disciplines that they might not have considered entering otherwise, because they would see very few people who look like them in those disciplines in positions of authority. And indeed, at times when I have been asked especially by senior colleagues, why a young woman like myself is interested in serious topics such as war, I certainly took comfort in knowing that I'm not alone, that there are other excellent women scholars, historians, including historians of war, who work not only to advance our field of study, but also to ensure that the image of a scholar, in my case of historian, is as diverse as our society. So studying women for me means giving them a voice. It means affording them greater visibility. It means making the picture a bit more complete, more nuanced, and often less black and white. And that is why it can be uncomfortable for some to bring women's experiences into topics that already seem familiar, But these topics are often based on male experiences or largely male experiences. It makes us challenge what we believe in. It makes us challenge our understanding, and for that reason, makes us feel uncomfortable. And I'll very briefly give you an example from my own work. So I've been studying history of wars, in particular the Second World War, but also the current one for some years. And most narratives of war, as you can imagine, focus on the battlefield, on the barracks, and on male experiences, because the majority of army personnel are men, right? And that means that they also often portray a kind of heroic male story, right? And it also means that the discussion of everything else that happens outside of the battlefields and army barracks is excluded. And that means experiences of civilians, many of whom are women, experiences of men who are not in uniform, and we have to remember that even in times of war, most men are civilians, and also experiences of service women who are a minority in the armed forces and often become a completely invisible minority. So studying narratives that seem to live on the margins of the main kind of historical narrative allows us to see that war does not only take place on the battlefield, right? It goes way beyond the military. And it's not just the story about heroic men. It's a story about society. It's about society in crisis. Yeah. And if we exclude the experiences of half of the population that experience this crisis, how can we learn a complete picture about it? And how can we learn how to deal with it? So that is why it matters so much to me, this topic, right? And the question of war, of course, is an important question for Ukraine society today, and we'll touch upon that in today's discussion, I hope. And as well as talking about challenges faced by women all over the world and in Ukraine in particular, discussions like today are also an opportunity for us to think about what's already been done by women over the decades. What's been done for a webinar like this to actually be able to take place. Here we are, several women who were able to gain education. All of us have PhDs. We come from different countries, we come from different backgrounds and different disciplines: history, cultural studies, anthropology, sociology, and we are able to talk about women's activism in public. I mean, for us to be able to do this, women before us had to do quite a lot of work. In other words, today's webinar is also an opportunity to celebrate the achievements of those who came before us, to express our gratitude, and to identify what efforts we should be focusing on to improve things for those who will follow in our footsteps. And that's enough from me for now. And now I'd love to introduce our speakers. So the first speaker is Dr. Emily Channell-Justice, and she's the director of the Temeti Contemporary Ukraine program at the Ukrainian Research Institute, Harvard University. She is a sociocultural anthropologist who has been doing research in Ukraine since 2012. She has pursued research on political activism and social movements among students and feminists during the 2013-14 Euromaidan protests. And Emily received her PhD from City University of New York in 2016. Welcome, Emily. Our second speaker is Dr. Tamara Martsenyuk. She's an associate professor at the Department of Sociology at University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. And she's a gender expert of Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union. She is the author of more than 100 academic publications. I will not list all of them here, including chapters of textbooks and academic books. But I'll mention a few titles, and I highly recommend all of them. So a book published in 2017 called Gender for All, Challenging Stereotypes. Another one published in 2018, Why One Should Not Be Afraid of Feminism. And the most recent book published in 2020, Defenders of the Galaxy, Power and Crisis in the Male World. And Tamara has also been at the heart of 3 sociological studies of the Invisible Battalion Initiative about women in the Ukrainian armed forces. And we'll hear about those later on. And our third speaker is Dr. Jessica Zychowicz. She recently published a monograph, Superfluous Women, Art, Feminism and Revolution in 21st Century Ukraine, published by Toronto University Press in 2020. She is currently based at the University of Alberta in the Contemporary Ukraine Studies program. And she was a US Fulbright Scholar in Area Studies in 2017 and 18 to National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in Ukraine. And she's received her doctorate from the University of Michigan. So a truly interdisciplinary, international panel of speakers tuning in from all sorts of different time zones. Okay, so let's begin then. I'm going to ask my first question, and it's going to be about today's date, the 8th of March. So Ukraine's been independent for over 30 years, for 30 years, and it's been slowly shedding Soviet traditions and replacing them with new, perhaps more appropriate ones. And 8th of March has often been at the heart of the kind of discussions, quite heated discussions about these changing traditions. So on the one hand, there are people who see the 8th of March as a continuation of the Soviet tradition, often quite rightly pointed out a hypocritical one. So, you know, the Soviet authorities introduced a day off on the 8th of March in the mid-1960s and was sort of celebrating women's participation in the workforce, paid labor, but at the same time, women were also expected in the Soviet Union to take responsibility for most of the unpaid domestic labor too, or what is known as double burden, right? So there are people who say, this is a Soviet tradition, we should reject it, we should move on. On the other hand, there are people who say, well, no, this is an International Women's Day, and this is an opportunity for us to talk about women's rights and challenges faced by women all over the world. And there are also those who say, well, what is wrong exactly with giving women flowers on the 8th of March and celebrating a certain type of femininity? So my question to you is, where do you stand on the 8th of March as such, but also what do you think about these discussions being so heated in Ukraine? And they have been so over the past few years. Tamara, I'd like to begin with you because I know that you attended Women's March today in Kyiv. Tell us a little bit about it, and also if you can answer those questions.
Hello to everyone. Thanks a lot for visiting our event, and Olesya, to you for organizing it. And really, there are a lot of debates around 8th of March, and actually I was invited on radio and some televisions to talk and to convince people why International Women's Day is actually important holiday recognized by United Nations, and what problems with gender equality are in Ukraine. And I was really happy today to participate in women's demonstration in Kyiv. I think there were around 2,000-3,000 people. Also, what is very important, there were demonstrations in around, I think, 15 other cities in Ukraine, and every year new cities join. For example, this year my home oblast, Volyn Oblast, Lutsk, joined also this Women's March. And also what is interesting, it's that demonstrators are very diverse, and you could see different, I would say, branches of feminism. There are some who are representatives of so-called liberal feminism, those who are left feminists, and those who are more critical or radical feminists, and also more men. I think more men are involved in this protest with some slogans to show that men also support gender equality. Also, the main, Olesya, you've been right that actually the main motto of this protest was women's face of pandemia, but also the same problem of ratification of Istanbul Convention, very famous document of Council of Europe on that is connected with gender-based violence, and it's actually one of the issues that conservative groups don't like and protest. And as every year, we also had some groups, or those who criticize gender, and so-called conservative groups. And now we have this Tradition и Порядок, Tradition and Order, who's been organizing anti-protest. And another important issue that actually diverse groups of women could make their statements, and we could hear, for example, so there were groups of women who support the idea of, or who are against sexism in politics, for example, women who are for women's leaderships, those who are for example, HIV/AIDS groups of women with disabilities. So you could see from pictures on protest, women and men on wheelchair, for example. Also, they were talking on women in Donbas and raised the issue and challenges of war. LGBT group was present. There were also groups of who's been raising issue of gender inequality in labor market and women's labor rights, and so on. So you could see really the huge diversity of postures and topics raised, and you could experience both some NGOs participating, but also grassroots initiatives. And so topics of labor market, gender-based violence, against sexism in politics, because previous local elections showed that women suffered from sexism, bullying, etc. And actually, I think it's in general, and it was, as far as I know, quite peaceful. So no one suffered physically from this conservative circles.
Just to say that this time last year I was in Lviv, in my hometown, and I was able to join the march, and I was fascinated by the variety, exactly what Tamara is describing, the variety of women who were present there, by the brave, young, confident voices who were speaking about the various challenges, by the sense of solidarity among those who came, men and women. It was really a wonderful atmosphere to be part of, and I was saddened by the fact that so many by the huge presence of the police on the one hand, that it was necessary for them to be there. On the other hand, I was really pleased that the city was taking it seriously and was ensuring that the protest, well, not the protest, the people who were joining the march were being safe. So it was a kind of day of mixed feelings, but still a day filled with really wonderful atmosphere. Jessica, Emily, would you like to share your views on the date of the 8th of March, but also these kind of heated discussions that we witness in Ukraine?
Sure. For me, March 8th is a very transnational story. I cannot separate myself as a researcher, as a woman, from my intellectual development. I embody my research, which is powerful in a transatlantic sense. My ancestors came from the regions of Poland and Western Ukraine, and like most East Europeans, they in the late 19th century ended up in New York working in the tenement homes, crowded into factories, textile factories. And these textile factories gave birth to the women's movement because women were fighting for workers' rights. And the suffragist movement was also converging with that at the same time. Most of the suffragists were white middle-class women. Race played a role in those early politics and who could access the ballot box and who could access labor protections. I like to believe a lot of progress has made, but we're still making progress. So for me, Ukraine has been, I counted how many years I've spent there. Over 30% of my adult life, I've been in Ukraine. I first came to Ukraine in 2005, 2007. As a volunteer English language teacher, and I helped to lead Girls Leading Our World camps, summer camps for girls. And this later led to more and more interest, and entering into grad school, I had a lot of ideas, but they didn't really solidify until I encountered feminist women in Kiev in 2011 when I went there to start my research for my dissertation. And they were forming a group called Ofenziva at the time, Feministyczna Ofenziva. And they asked me to translate their manifesto into English, which I did. So again, the power of language, the power of connecting across oceans became very tangible to me in a way that I knew was so important. I knew this was big, even if my advisors over on the other side of the ocean had never heard of this group before. They started organizing the Women's March around that time. And, you know, it was really taking off. Much later, though, in 2017, after I saw the Women's March in DC, which I also attended, I attended the Women's March in DC with Ukrainian women from Ukrainian Women's League of America, the chapter in Ann Arbor that I had been communicating with as a student, rebuilding endowment there for Ukrainian studies in the wake of Roman Shporluk's tenure there. And these women were also connecting with domestic violence activists who were visiting from Ukraine in DC that day. So the date, again, I want to be concise in my answer because I can go on here, but I want to save more for later. The date of March 8th is one that oftentimes gets separated out into different, national stories, when actually it's a very interesting global phenomenon. And in Washington, D.C. in 2017, that particular march became like an anti-Trump march, an anti-authoritarian march. And this is happening today, in Myanmar and all over the world, which is not bad, but there's also something very special to be preserved in the uniqueness of a women's march, and what does it mean even to be a woman, and what are these rights we're fighting for? So that's what I've been returning to in my scholarship, and later I will reference some of my published texts for researchers out there who would like to read something later following up on some of these ideas. But I'll turn the floor over now to Emily.
Yes, thank you. And thanks, Olesya, so much for organizing this important event and for bringing together such an interesting group of people. I'm here also to listen. So and thank you for these interesting questions. This is a great place to start. I think for me, the whole question of March 8th has been of interest because it's really not something that we think about that much in the United States. It's not an institutionalized holiday at all. And so my first impressions were always from international students who were celebrating it at university campuses, for example. And my first real experience with the actual celebration of the date itself was right after Euromaidan, the mass uprisings in February of 2014. That March in 2014, Crimea annexation had just happened. And so the feminist activists who I had been spending time with organized a solidarity event from the women of Kiev Support the Women of Crimea. And we wrote postcards and we sent some videos. And to me, it was really an interesting introduction to the holiday because it was about women and it was about women's rights, but it was also really significant to ground that conversation in the political things that were happening precisely at that time. And that's something I think, as we talk through this discussion today, one of the things that Ukrainian feminists, I think, have very distinctively and successfully done is to really ground their own work in the political context of what's going on around them that isn't just to do with women's issues, so-called women's issues. What's also been really interesting for me as a scholar is to look at the pushback against March 8th as a political event. And to me, that pushback comes entirely out of the effort to turn it into a political holiday, talking about women's rights instead of just a celebration of women. There's something really, really different there when women are saying, actually, we want to use this day to make our own demands, and to talk about the things that are important to us and to talk about what we need. That's when we start to see a pushback because women are starting to take up political space. That's not what, as you mentioned in the beginning, that's not what this holiday was initially about, right? It was about let's honor women for being women, not for defining how they want to be women. And so that's, to me, what makes the 8th of March really interesting to study and what makes it a really powerful day for me. And then the last thing I think is interesting that you also hinted at, which is the connections with the Soviet period and the fact that so much of the rejection of this holiday comes from its connections with Ukraine's communist past. And so something for those of us who are kind of looking analytically at the 8th of March, the way that Ukrainian women and Ukrainian feminists are taking the 8th of March, making it their own, making it something particular to Ukraine, making it arguably more of a political moment than it was in the Soviet period. I think that's really incredible. And I think some of the pushback, though, also comes from its relationship with communism. I'll stop there so that we can keep going.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on this. Just to briefly add, I think whenever I see the argument around the 8th of March, the various publications every year, new voices coming up to talk about it, I'm actually really pleased, because I think if we argue, if we talk to each other, we educate one another, we hear each other, and when there's a discussion, heated or not, that's a sign of progress for sure. Excellent. So moving on to my second question, it also sort of relates to the title of our webinar today, 30 Years of Activism. The issues that women campaign for have changed over the last 3 decades, for sure. So my question is twofold. How did these issues change? What were women concerned with in the 90s, in 2000s, and are concerned about now? And also, do you notice in your work a certain continuity, perhaps tradition of women's activism in Ukraine that we can speak of? Maybe a clear communication, a link between the different generations of activists, of women activists in Ukraine. So Emily, can I start with you and maybe give us a little bit of, ask you to give us a little bit of a kind of wider context, position Ukraine in the post-Soviet space? We are talking about, post-Soviet activism today.
Well, and in saying that, I think it's also still important to talk about the experience of women in socialism as well. We can't really fully understand how women are experiencing post-socialism if we don't talk about their experiences in socialism itself. And so we often think about the experience of women in socialism in a pretty singular way. So we talk about women were promised a certain kind of equality, but they experienced the double burden of wage work and reproductive work, and so that equality didn't exist. And that's not an entire, and that's helpful, right? That's a good kind of starting point, but it's a lot more complicated than that. And I was just thinking in a couple of examples, we know that the effects of Soviet colonizing projects, for instance, and modernizing projects were different on women in different places. So I was thinking about the unveiling campaigns in Central Asia, these kind of forced modernizing projects that were trying to make women into the kind of new Soviet person that was being established. That happens differently across the region. And so, and I've also been reading a lot about Crimea right now and thinking about the deportation of Crimean Tatars from the peninsula. The experience of Crimean women has been different than the experience of Ukrainian women. So there's no one universal experience of socialism for women. And I think this is important because that's what helps us understand what experiences were shared among women after 1991 and where their experiences diverged. And one of the significant continuities around the region in the 1990s is the economic impacts of the end of state socialism, because this means that women's relationship with wage work changed. Economic instability has plagued almost everybody, as we know. And growing economic inequality also changed how women viewed what was possible. And so this economic instability, I think, is a really significant circumstance that is a continuity that's shared among most post-socialist women, but how women respond to those economic shifts is different, not only in each independent republic, but also, as we know, among women of different economic and political statuses. And so this is why we get to see somebody like Yulia Tymoshenko, who emerges from the 1990s with a massive amount of political and economic power, but at the same time, we don't see a general increased access to economic power or political power for women in Ukraine. And so I think, in terms of continuities, also as scholars, we have contributed to these sort of glossing narratives that make us look at the region in in certain ways that are contingent on access to resources. So one of the main examples here, if you've read a lot of research coming out of the region, a lot of authors looked at the growth of domestic violence shelters and women's activism around domestic violence, which happens in the 1990s because global women's organizations have defined this as a priority for women. Now, this doesn't mean that it's not a priority. It just means that the reasons that certain things become popular or prominent aren't actually based on women's experiences on the ground, and they're not based on women making decisions for themselves, but they're based on external factors. So again, we start to see, women are perceived to have the same experience of post-socialism, but those institutions, those funding organizations aren't actually asking women about their priorities. And I noted just a couple, there's work from Ukraine about this, work from Russia, work from Bulgaria. It's really around the region. We assume that, these externally defined problems are the same. And I really think that this is why we see women responding to activism in different ways across the region. So that's why women in Ukraine have a different role in protests than, for example, what we see in Belarus. So in Belarus, we've seen a lot of, and I've heard a lot of really interesting people talk about the role of women in protests as leading the protests, as being the motor of the protest. That's different than what we typically say about women in Ukraine. And so it's how women have responded to these different challenges, to the birth of the idea of women's issues in the region. So how the different ways that women have responded, I think, is something that's really important for us to look at, and I think has developed in a really fascinating way in Ukraine since the 1990s.
That's perfect, Emily. Thank you so much. And we'll come back to this sort of specificity of Ukrainian case later on in our discussion. I'd like to ask Jessica whether you notice much change over the 3 decades in artistic representation of activism.
Sure. So my book, which is here, and to the audience, anybody who's interested in reading this, and if you have a hardship that prevents you from accessing it, let me know through my website. I will make sure you have a way to access it. But the subtitle is Art, Feminism, and Revolution in 21st Century Ukraine. Some of these things intersect, sometimes they don't. It's not a book about feminist art. It's actually a book about all 3 of these things that intersect in different ways. I found early on that the organizers of the March 8th March, many of them were interested in film. And the first conference that they hosted was largely dedicated to a film festival called Zhinka z Kinokamerою, named after Dziga Vertov, the director who did a lot of work in Ukraine. But what is interesting to me about that, and also the aesthetics that I'm looking at in my book, the intersection of art and politics being one that we would say is an aesthetic. It carries a lot of forms from the 1920s, and returning right now to the 20s, I think, in these conversations about what wave of feminism we're in is important, because oftentimes in translating conversations between East and West, we can lose sight of vocabulary and talk past each other. The legislation of the woman question and of feminism in the NEP era, which I talk about in reference to Eric Nyman's book, Sex in Public, is still what produces throughout Eastern Europe and the post-Soviet territories a kind of allergy to this term. It's a very awkward term everywhere. It's been weaponized in ways that do a lot of harm to people really on the ground. But I think what is really valuable about creative production is that going back to the 1920s, it provides a language that is ambiguous and ambivalent. You can't legislate a painting in the same way as you can, a pamphlet calling for some kind of massive change, or artists oftentimes, they don't have aspirations to govern. In fact, There's a long and rich and beautiful tradition in Ukraine of a detachment from politics or preservation of Ukrainian folk culture against the legislation by the state that was, killing, literally executing artists for expressing any national sentiments. So in contemporary Ukraine, what has been really great about the marches that I've attended is the explosion of creative expression, and artists like Dana Kavalina's banner in 2018 became a litmus for the intersection of not only art and politics, but also how far the civic code of protest that was instituted on Maidan could be exercised peacefully. Her poster featuring a nude woman was actually taken to court by opposition groups that were at the march acting against it. And the poster was acquitted, but it sparked a really important conversation that later that year led to a museum exhibit in Pinchukort Center called A Space of One's Own, named after Virginia Woolf's text, which is also interesting because her text was translated into Ukrainian in the 1970s and had a very negative reception at first and was retranslated later. The reception changed. But what I want to also point out is that the artists, many of them, in Ukraine, are also working in NGOs or have wear multiple hats. Like the people are neither this nor that. That you can also be, a pro-LGBT activist attending the LGBT march, which is a Kiev Pride is a separate event, and support the Women's March. That there's fluidity between these things and solidarities that are really important. And that's another area that creative expression and the arts give us, is ways of understanding each other without having to really understand in advance necessarily a lot of contextual information. That it's immediacy for an audience abroad, in China, to look at this poster and think, wow, there's something really interesting happening in this march that is unique to Ukraine. And then they can follow up and learn more about it. So in today's social media environment, I think that art and images are becoming more and more important, because that is how information travels. And it's also very interesting to study in terms of propaganda and disinformation, and undercutting that with the individuality, the individual expression that artists give us is totally counter to what the mass media can exploit, or the disinformation campaigns can reduce into a categorical us versus them, or excluding different populations from networks of care. So that's what I've observed in recent years.
That's absolutely fascinating. Not only the concerns changed, or to some degree changed, the expression of those changes all the time as well, and the way we reach our audiences change too. And it has a profound impact on how effective or not we are. Tamara, you've written about so many things to do with this question. You can probably do a 3-hour webinar all by yourself. I remember your work on women's access to labor market, gender pay gap, all sorts of things that are very relevant. But what I'd like you to talk about now a little bit more is the most recent concerns related to specifically the conflict in Eastern Ukraine and Donbas, the war, and the role of women, both, the involvement of women both as civilian volunteers, but also as service women. Tell us a little bit about the Invisible Battalion, and I know you'd like to tell us more about the most recent study that you conducted as part of that advocacy campaign.
Thanks a lot. As a public sociologist, I think in order to have some changes and our research will lead to changes, we need to have a cooperation of different so-called actors. And actually we have some continuity from 90s, but I think now in 2010s and 20s, we have more of this cooperation between scholars, researchers, media, journalists, people from media, also different vulnerable groups who suffer some problems, and also politicians. And actually, I see now that it became possible to make some changes to improve some labor rights, for example, military women, because of this cooperation. And it's a really very interesting case. When we started this research on the situation with women in anti-terrorist operation after war started, it was initiated by those women, Maria Berlinska and others, and actually it made some changes, and it was some advocacy, because those military women who suffered this violation of labor rights, they stand for their own. And also it was some media campaign, and there were some journalists, and there were some politicians, and I would say it was some positive issues. Nevertheless, the fact that that this research is quite controversial, because as far as you know, even through feminist perspective, some feminist groups, they criticize visibility of women in military sphere. And Invisible Battalion, it's a liberal feminist project on visibility of women, but still it's initiated by these groups who were suffered from violation of their rights. But recently our last study is connected with a very sensitive topic for Ukraine, that is part of gender-based violence, and it's sexual harassment in military sphere. In general, maybe you remember that in Ukraine in 2016, it was this online campaign, I'm Not Afraid to Say It, initiated by journalist and activist Nastya Melnichenko. And it was mainly about sexual violence. And actually, it was even a bit before Me Too campaign. And after this, I think it was a very important event when different groups, they started to talk more on the most taboo aspects of gender-based violence, different forms of sexual violence. And actually in my sphere, in education, in higher education, we had some scandals connected with also sexual harassment in education. And some universities, for example, my Kiev Mogila Academy, Taras Shevchenko, and other, now it's more and more universities, they implemented internal university policies on anti-discrimination and on gender equality and on prevention of sexual harassment. But what we face now, we actually soon as the results will be will be ready. We did a quite large sociological study with different data, with public opinion surveys. We interviewed women and men, military and veterans, who experienced sexual harassment or were witnesses or witnessed it. And we gathered some statistics from hotlines, whatever. And we have now some cases, court cases. One of this challenge in Ukraine still, despite quite good legislation, but actually as for sexual harassment, we don't have, I would say, good legislation. We need ratification of Istanbul Convention in order to have in other major legislation criminalization of different forms of sexual harassment, not only rape or attempt of rape. And actually, we have Valeria Sikal and Olga Derkach, two women who, I would say, dared to have court cases. And one of the huge challenge in Ukraine is a court system. As you may know from different protests, actually we need huge reform in court system. And in general, in Ukraine, still there are very few cases on gender discrimination, on positive cases of gender-based violence, rape, sexual violence, etc. So it's one of the challenges, and we hope that this, it's very taboo. So like sexual harassment in general in labor market, it's not very, it's, I would say, quite taboo topic, not very well discussed, recognized. So it's still one of the issues that could be faced and could be changed with the ratification of Istanbul Convention.
Tamara, can I just, in case I missed it, I just ask you to remind us when the findings will be published of the most recent study?
They will be so probably in 2 or 3 weeks, I hope. But what is like as an also as an education activist, I believe that through education we could change change our stereotypes and some discrimination. I think what is also important is that we try also to make some changes into military education, because still not actually women, they don't have full access to military education. And also this in general education is very, it faces a number of problems. So we launched online course on like basic of gender education and prevention of sexual harassment for military. So now it's in the process, and we have different people from military who are reading our lectures that we prepared, and I really hope that it will be that this educational online initiative will be helpful to change the perception.
And if I may, just a quick follow-up question on that subject. You know, the take-up by the military, which is an institution that has its traditions and perhaps doesn't like to have them challenged, of the issues that you're raising, how much of it do you see is part of the desire to truly reform, and how much of it, I think what Emily mentioned earlier, that some of the kind of encouragement comes from outside of Ukraine? How much of it is a box-ticking exercise to seem that they are reforming, and that the gender is listed as part of their priorities and is ticked, it's done, it's dealt with? What is your view?
It depends. There are always some people who truly support some reforms in military, and actually those people, those particular persons, they helped, supported our first Invisible Battalion, both men and women in military. But of course, as far as there is national action plan on this 1325, it's UN Security Council resolution that Ukraine is part, and there are some instructions. So sometimes, of course, military, they need to follow these instructions, but actually through then this formal bureaucratic perspective, later you see that from this group of people, at least a couple are interested, and it's really sometimes it's driven but by some particular persons. But of course we need a change in system. Yes, and we need political will, for example, to face these cases of sexual harassment. As for Valeria Sikal, even international human rights NGO Amnesty International took this case because it's already for 2 years. It's a very long, and if Valeria now moved to Poland because she can't live here due to the pressure, bullying, whatever, and with Olha Derkach is the same. And even we as a scholars, when you study this issue, you also face some bullying, some problems. And it's you may know also about other scholars who study problems of sexual violence in armed forces through historical perspective. When you criticize this memory politics and in general this national history memory, so it's also quite challenging, yes, for scholars to study this. But at least now you see for last years, 7, 8, that it's possible to talk publicly on these issues.
Indeed, that is a true change, and perhaps we should organize another conversation about the line between scholarship and activism. You know, where is it? It's so difficult to sometimes draw it. Speaking of activism, I'm going to ask you another question about it, but I'd like to encourage our attendees to submit their questions in the Q&A box function on Zoom, because this is going to be the last question from me, and we will open the discussion in about 10 minutes or so. I would really like to hear from you, but please do keep your questions coming before we open the discussion. So the question I'd like to ask all three of you relates to this idea of activism. I mean, we've been talking about it, it's in the title of our webinar, but what does it actually mean? Women tend to be relegated, or have been historically relegated, to the private sphere, right? Activism is about making your voice heard in public, in the sphere that is often dominated by men rather than women, the sphere that does not open itself naturally, organically to women's voices. And in my research about participation of women on the Maidan, what I noticed was that whether women wanted or not, whether they were there, you know, talking about gender equality or not, or their primary concerns were completely different, they had to stand up for their rights as citizens. Yeah, that's what everybody who came to the protests did. But they also had to stand up for their rights to make their voices heard in the protest space, to create that space, to be allowed that space, to not be squeezed out from the protest space, which makes it really rather challenging to become an activist or to be actively involved. So that's what I'd like you to comment on, if possible. Emily, perhaps you can start with your observation of the Maidan protests. I really liked your paper, "We're Not Just Sandwiches." That's the title, or part of the title, because it's true. I mean, again, those of us who observed the Maidan, we could see that women were mostly encouraged to start at least in the kitchens, and even if that was their choice, they wanted to work in the kitchens or sort of providing care and so all the traditionally feminine duties, they were then perceived as helpers of the revolutionaries. That's not seen as a revolutionary activity, even though all of those people on the Maidan needed that tea and those sandwiches, right?
Yes, that's such a great way to put it, of what's being defined as a revolutionary act, or the support of the revolutionary act, right? And the article that you referenced talks specifically about how feminists went to Maidan, wanted to participate, but found that they were not being allowed to define the space in which they participated. And so the article looks at how certain feminist activists took it upon themselves to make the demand for that space, and also how it was received. And to some extent, you know, it wasn't received especially well. You know, women's positions didn't necessarily change. A lot of the activism ended up kind of going online to have discussions among other women, instead of making feminist claims to be kind of a central part of Maidan. But at the same time, you know, just the fact of women coming out to these protests and saying, okay, I don't want to just make sandwiches. This is my country too. I would like to be behind the barricades. You know, you can't tell me that just because I'm a woman, I shouldn't be here protecting my country if that's what I want to do. That was a huge step. And my broader research that took place during Euromaidan looks at different kinds of groups, including feminists, but also leftist activists, and how they found space for themselves in these protests, which were not always entirely welcoming to diverse groups of people. And the way that the protests ended up having a much bigger reverberation among women to create spaces for themselves, I think, is a lasting legacy. So for some women, this turned into organizing and participating in the women's brigades, which you have probably, lots of people, I think Tamara has written about this as well. And it's in my article, and Sarah Phillips, Marian Rubchak have written about it. So there's real diversity of perspectives on the matter. And you can also imagine that feminists in Ukraine had different responses on the matter, which I thought was really interesting. On the one hand, we saw feminists saying, this is how we create the space for ourselves, is we create these groups, these ways of being among women. We organize self-defense classes, for example, or whatever we think we need, we get to control what we do. Whereas some other feminists responded in ways that said, actually, this is really just imitating the male structures that already exist in these protests. And that's not really empowering, right? That's just adhering to the kind of patriarchal standards that have been set by others. And so I think, that the way that Euromaidan created the space for this plurality of kinds of feminism is actually really essential. And it created a space for a plurality of kinds of activism too. I mean, women who participated on Maidan weren't inevitably feminists. And so, how different women navigated that space, some of which became based on activism toward gender equality and about women's issues and about feminism, and some of which was not at all related to feminism. I think that's really important to think about in terms of women kind of asking for the space themselves. And I think this also speaks to a kind of greater issue that we have seen throughout the study of feminism and women's activism in Ukraine. And this goes back to Marta Bohachevsky-Chomyak's pioneering work that looks at women in Ukraine from 1884 to 1939, which seems beyond this discussion, but it really isn't, because she's talking about the apparent clash between nationalism and feminism, and lots of other excellent scholars have taken this topic on. But the question always comes back to, how can we talk about feminism when we're still working on securing national sovereignty in Ukraine? How can the feminist project be a priority when the national project isn't finished? And I think Euromaidan actually created the space for women to really navigate that question and make that decision for themselves. And, some of them were able to take on the question of a feminist nation building project, whereas others left feminism behind to take on the nation building project instead. Neither, and I wouldn't claim to kind of value either one more or less. And I think that the fact that the space was created for women to make those demands themselves, that's really the essential takeaway about activism that I would contribute here.
Absolutely. This idea of nedachasi, something being untimely, we heard it over and over again, starting with Maidan and now with the war. And we can really see the evidence of the fact that it is timely to talk about these issues now, because this is an opportunity for us to change things, for reforms to be implemented, for voices to be raised. Absolutely. Jessica, can I ask you whether there's any difference between women's revolutionary art and men's revolutionary art?
No difference.
Excellent.
I think if you are a feminist, identifying as a feminist, or if you are maybe identifying as trans or any other gender, I think if you're creating art that is pro-women, pro-feminist, pro-gender equality, that is your statement. And artists I've worked with as a curator, for example, Nikita Kadan, whose exhibit right now is on display in Kiev, Skalichyn Myth, Mutilated Myth, a very provocative title. He has, really put his career forward in making statements that are not popular and that are difficult in order to discuss sexual violence in history. I want to, again, just to turn the lens to build on what Emily is also saying about the importance of history and our mothers and our grandmothers. Right now, there is a major generational turnover happening. We have to collect oral histories. We need to create archives. We need to do the project of recovery and also building our language that can describe adequately our circumstances. This is how I view my academic work in an activist way. And I have such a privilege here in Canada, actually, to be in Edmonton, which has an incredible history of feminism. And I want to name names and bring forward Myrna Kostash into Ukrainian translation, for example, Hristya Chomyak, Lida Somchinsky, all of Marisha Bachorkiev, who is writing a trilogy of being a queer Ukrainian Canadian, and beautifully written. So, you know, these women also really broke barriers and made significant changes for domestic violence issues in immigrant communities, because Ukraine is a circular project. There are voters here who vote on Ukrainian laws, but they are living in Canada because Canada has and recognizes dual citizenship. And the 1970s, 1980s, feminists were building the Hromada housing co-op, which has given lower income and working class access to over 200 buildings now, I believe, that are part of this co-op. These are lessons that my generation needs to learn from. We need strategies and methodologies. And I want to say thank you to Tamara and Emily, who have been so enriching for over 10 years. We are a community. We have helped each other with our work for so long. And I also want to add to the conversation Olga Plahotnik and Maria Mayerchik, who are here in Edmonton with me, my colleagues. They were original founders of the March 8th March in Kiev, and they are openly LGBT, and they have experienced a lot of backlash for that. So we need our community to be supportive and to be multi-generational. We need our memories. We need our grandmothers and our mothers and our daughters too. My daughter was born 1 year ago, yesterday. She decided not to come on March 8th, but the day before. And I have seen up front what it's like to be a parent in the pandemic. I think, also my partner is an activist. He's making today possible for me because of his labor, taking care of our daughter right now, so I can be part of this talk. And we need to, and we will see more and more parents' movements and parents speaking out about what it needs to raise a child post-COVID. I also just want to give a footnote to Katalin Fabian's work, she's an editor who created, she's a scholar of law and human rights law, but she recently published a phenomenal book that documents parents' rights movements throughout Eastern Europe and comparative cases of several different countries. So that's my 2 cents, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the audience. Thank you.
Super. So can I please invite our first attendee to ask that question, and that's Irina Zamoruyeva, I believe, yeah?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for really amazing talks. It's just so wonderful to hear all the solidarity, activism, science flowing through all the digital cables. My question was a very open one, and I was very curious to hear either of you or all of your reflections on the ecofeminisms in Ukraine, because it does have a very interesting history. So whether that's a topic that it intersected with and can offer any thoughts, reflections, observations of alliances between the ecological movements and the different feminist groups beyond the anti-nuclear 90s kind of start of that. Thank you.
Would anybody like to take that one?
Unfortunately, this last year, as far as I remember, in this women's demonstration, it was a group of environmental activists who also joined this. And now, as far as I know, we don't have particular visible organized group of feminist environmental activists. It's only, but there is a wish somehow to intersect those directions. And for example, in the summer, despite of pandemic, I was lucky to visit one event, so-called Green Academy, where different activists from different spheres, we were talking on intersection of gender, environment, and some other issues. And it was actually one of the future topics to develop. It's how to make more this environmental women's activism more visible. And actually, currently I'm teaching course on gender studies, and there, I have a group of students, and they are doing currently research on the gender aspects of environmental activism in Ukraine. So some, for example, NGOs, they say that there is feminization of activism, that among younger activists and NGOs members who are coming, there are more and more women. Probably they may be inspired by Greta Thunberg, or so they challenge this idea of typical environmental activist from Greenpeace, for example. And so my students, they now study, they interview different activists of different generations, because in environmental activism we also have, as in women's activism, different groups of activists. And currently we can't say, but we see that there is feminization of environmental activists, and it's one of the interesting issue to develop.
Excellent. Thank you. If nobody else wishes to comment, we'll move on to the second question, and that's from our attendee, Tatiana Drula.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for this talk today. I really enjoyed it. I have a kind of a general question, and this is what kind of books or readings you would recommend for men. And they don't have to be specifically written for men, but something that would give them an overall introduction about the obstacles and issues that women face in general, because those can be many, from the way we are raised, in the workplace, in social life and things like that. Just really a whole introduction of how the many challenges that we can face and what women do about them. This is for men that I find mean well, but they don't even know where to start. They don't, they maybe are not doing anything wrong themselves, and surrounded by people who also are not being, bad in any way to women, but just generally don't understand what the problem is and what they can do about it. So mainly for men who want to do something, but they don't understand all of the problems, and they don't understand what they can do.
Excellent question. And perhaps I could also ask Tamara, but perhaps others too, to comment on He for She campaign. And I know it's, quite powerful in Ukraine at the moment. Lots of men are joining that campaign. So Tamara, shall we start with you?
Oh yeah, I just would like to recommend a book that is actually even translated to Ukrainian. The authors is Michael Kimmel. It's American sociologist, one of the co-founder of National Organization of Men Against Sexism, and Michael Kaufman. It's an activist from Canada, White Ribbon Campaign. And actually they wrote together like a popular book on Men About Feminism, something like this. And this book was translated into Ukrainian and presented in Kiev Book Fair, Kiev Arsenal, in 2019. And actually now I think there are more and more books that especially men writing to men, how like why gender equality is also useful for men. So there are even some documentary movies on this, but I advise to start with Kimmel and Kaufman. As for She campaign, it's also debatable, because some activists, they don't like title. Yes, He for She. At the same time, in Ukraine, actually, UN Women, they organize this campaign, and they try to find, different feminist men, and there are more and more. And I'm, for example, I'm personally very positively surprised that more of them are among journalists. They invite for some programs. Usually, like I sometimes sick and tired of visiting programs, especially when the journalists are not for gender equality. but recent tendencies that more and more men they support, and this campaign, actually is not only in media. They try to go to universities, and because of pandemic, of course they postponed this. But I think it's very cool that, for example, because still in universities and gender education is not very popular, and we do need to do a lot with education. So they try to find in universities those professors, scholars who support and students, because it's connected with student self-government and student NGOs, and encourage them to promote gender equality.
Great. Jessica, Emily, would you like to offer your recommendations?
I recommend Tamara's book.
Yes, so do I.
Multiple books, and in Ukrainian and in English. There have been a lot of good textbooks and anthologies published in recent years, also pertaining to Ukraine, Mapping Difference, which I know Tamara has contributed to, edited by Marian Rupchak, has a fantastic introduction. It's about 15 pages. That gives a really good overview to the scope of what we're talking about today.
Great. Emily?
Thanks for this question. I was spending both other answers thinking about it, and I feel like I don't necessarily have a different contribution. I think two things though. So I used to teach sex and culture in New York City Public University, and it was really fun to break down the categories of sex and gender, to sort of look at them as social constructs, and look at the ways that especially masculinity affects men in negative ways. And so it wasn't so much about convincing men that they should be feminists, but also looking at how the gender order as a whole is negative for both men and women, and how men are also oppressed by the gender order. And I think that was always a really eye-opening thing. My favorite text for doing that is Pierre Bourdieu's Symbolic Violence, Gender and Symbolic Violence, which is a very dense theoretical text. So it was also just a fun exercise to get students to engage with that. But that's one that always, because it really frames things as us committing or allowing ourselves to be influenced by a gender order that we didn't set up ourselves. And it really allows us to explore how this structure affects us all individually, as well as in relation to one another. So that would be my brief recommendation. And just, I think it's important to say here that there is a criticism. I think this sort of touches on both questions. There is a criticism among certain feminists in Ukraine, and it's resonant with feminism here as well. It's not enough for men to just say, I'm a feminist, and that means they're a feminist. Actions they always speak louder than words. And, I think it's also important for everybody to learn the lessons of how the gender order is oppressive. But there are plenty of examples of men who self-identify as feminists, and then who still, their actions are not liberatory for all people. And I would also just add here that's an attention to intersectionality based on race, based on class, but also based on gender identity, based on one's sexual identity. These are long-term issues that I think feminism as a topic has to sort of deal with, and there's space for everyone. I do firmly believe that, but we can't just call ourselves something and then that means that that's what it is, right? It's a longer educational process, which is also what we've been talking about here. So thanks for your question.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We have so many questions. It's really exciting. Before I invite another speaker to ask their question, attendee to ask their question via video, I'd like to read one out from Rebecca Harms. And her question is very brief. Do you think we could develop more influence to move some of the burning issues via the Ukrainian Women's Congress? Would anybody like to take that question? Tamara, please.
I can take, because I think a year and a half I met Rebecca in the line to this event, and I like this event, but what I would like to criticize, I think there is much more too much stress in this event on politics and on bringing these topics that are not very critical and not inviting. For example, I would like to see more scholars, people from different other spheres, not only political and business elite, and more from who could bring more other critical perspective, and who could talk publicly, like on sexual harassment, sexual violence, poor wages of nurses, and some problems with education, that there is lack of critical education, sex education, whatever. So I think it would be really good to develop this Congress and make it more diverse and inclusive.
Excellent. Any other comments from the speakers for this particular question? Jessica, please.
Sure. I've seen in the thread a couple of questions about how to get involved from the US. There's so many wonderful organizations dedicated to Ukraine, Ukrainian women, Ukrainian National Women's League of America is a really, really good one too, that I've worked with. But also, I guess in my small way, I've been actively building an archive at the Labadie in University of Michigan, and I'm collecting materials from participants of feminist activists or other kinds of women's and pro-LGBT events. One of the challenges for students, I think, in North America is accessing a lot of contemporary firsthand materials that are published in Ukraine, because they're often published in small print runs or maybe not translated. So I think building those access points is really great. And here's just one material, one example. This is a catalog from the exhibit that was curated by Oksana Brukovecka called Textus, Vishivka, Textile, Feminism. It's wonderful, beautiful, uses the form of the Vyshyvanka in new and exciting ways to make statements about women's rights in Ukraine. This was recent, it was 2018, I believe. And also looking back and looking forward at the same time, here is a book that Solomia Pavlichko wrote when she was leaving Edmonton in 1991, 30 years ago, because we're talking about 30 years of women's activism in Ukraine. Solomia Pavlichko really did a lot to bring the word feminism into conversation in Ukraine at a young age. She was in her 30s, and this month, 30 years ago, she was writing letters about all of the changes that were happening from her front row view in the Rada in Ukraine with the dissolution of the USSR. This is a really valuable book. It's translated by Myrna Kostash, who's with us in the audience. Beautiful translation. It reads like it was written yesterday. And I'm going to be creating an anthology of literature, poetry, and also visual culture critique. And I know Emily Channell has done an anthology recently dedicated to LGBT rights. Maybe she can mention that as well. So please stay in conversation with us and others. There's a lot you can do. This is just the beginning, and I hope that some of those references will help you pick your own adventure.
Wonderful. May I please invite Grant Schreiner, if I said your name correctly, forgive me if I didn't, to ask your question.
Sure. Can you see? Yep, there you go. My question is, and first of all, thank you for such a great panel. Does Ukrainian feminism have its basis in Ukraine's Soviet past or from Western influences like Europe and the United States and Canada? And do you think that Ukrainian feminism is ultimately going to be similar to Western feminism, or will it be unique? Thank
Excellent.
you.
Thank you so much, Grant. And in fact, it was one of the questions that I was going to ask, but ran out of time. What's Ukrainian about Ukrainian women's activism or Ukrainian feminism, if anything? Please, who'd like to start? Emily, please.
Start. Yeah, thanks for that question. I started touching on it a little bit at the end of what my original comments, and one of the things that I do think makes Ukrainian feminism unique is the tension between nation building and the role of women within building that nation. And I think that's that question in particular has, I think, framed the direction of Ukrainian feminist activism maybe more than in other places, and maybe more than any other question in terms of feminism in Ukraine. I mean, I think, and if I may recommend my own article recently that I published in Feminist Anthropology Journal, I'll try to find a link to that when I'm done speaking here, where I look at kind of a genealogy of feminism in the region, and that might be useful so that, because one of the things that I talk about is that precisely what you're saying there, these dual influences of the Soviet period and Soviet defined kinds of feminism that establish one sort of gender regime. And then at the same time, you have, especially in the 90s, these ideas about what is feminism that come out of the Western world that are sort of imposed in Ukraine and around the region. I would say that both of those things have influenced the direction of Ukrainian feminism, and neither of those things is a bad thing, right? They help Ukrainian feminism be unique. They also put pressure on Ukrainian feminists to find this space to define for themselves what they want to do with feminism. And I also, I popped in the chat the Routledge handbook that Jessica sort of mentioned really briefly. I think it's really pricey, so I hope that your libraries will all get it. But that volume, which is co-edited by Katalin Fabian, Mara Lazda, and one of my mentors, Janet Johnson, they really also look at that exactly. I mean, that includes authors who look specifically at the Soviet experience, who look specifically at how Western feminism came in and tried to influence the development of feminism. And what I think that they do remarkably in that volume is that they're not just using like, okay, here's how it happened in Ukraine, here's how it happened in Bulgaria, right? They're really looking at these global transnational processes that were really essential. And that's exactly, to me, what makes this interesting.
Ukraine finds itself at the crossroads in so many different ways, and that's not necessarily a bad place to be in, because that's where cultures mix, that's where influences come together, and that's why Ukraine makes such an exciting case study, for sure. Tamara, please.
Yeah, if you allow, I answer this question also and combine with the question of Oksana Dubchak, who is asking about power struggle inside feminist movement in Ukraine and how title was changed from feminist march to women's march, and case with this artist Dana Kavelina and her poster, and some problems that are connected with it. Actually, I think Ukrainian feminist activism or women's activism, it faces the similar challenges that any other feminist activism abroad. It's about solidarity and how to bring common agenda when even as different feminist groups, they can't agree on some issues about title, about slogans, to what extent they could be critical or not. And of course, it's a very pity. I agree with Oksana. I personally also, as a participant of first marches, I like more feminism. I didn't study particularly why this was changed, but probably to make it more, of course, more attractive and more inclusive for other and more attractive for very ordinary women. And I think that yeah, it's a very pity that sometimes there are some problems, especially when there are some more critical groups who are coming. At the same time, I think I'm in general optimist, and I think that even despite these challenges, what I could think, for example, how to bring what I feel lack of, how to bring, for example, nurses and kindergarten and school teachers and kindergarten teachers to this protest. For example, we have problem of very low salary of nurses, and it would be really great not to talk for nurses not being a nurse, yes, but to bring a group of nurses to this protest, and they could talk of themselves. For example, even on this protest, it was really weird to hear some group was shouting some words of support of rural women. And it was really weird, because probably we didn't have like some rural like NGOs who are who represent rural women, and so I think that so to conclude, Ukrainian feminism faces the similar international challenges, and we even didn't talk on issue of prostitution and how to regulate it, and issue of trans inclusive exclusive activism, and etc. Unfortunately, it's but it's I think it's common problem of any activism. The more it's profound, the more it developed, it's more diverse inside, and there are more quarrels inside and fights for resources, for visibility, for power. And issue of solidarity is one of the very important in this.
Tamara, thank you so much. I'm afraid we're desperately running out of time, and we should be finishing right now, but with your permission, I will allow one more question, and that's from Daphna Rachok, because it looks ahead, it looks forward, and I'd love to end on a question where we sort of look at the next, next step. What does the future hold for all of us? Daphna, please.
Hi, I would like to thank to all the panelists for the great discussion. And well, we have talked about the 30 years of women's activism in Ukraine, and I would like to invite you to speculate a little bit about the future now. And basically, my question is this: which trends and tendencies in the women's movement in Ukraine do you see as becoming less emphasized and maybe getting less attention in the next decade or so? And which trends do you think will become kind of like more prominent and more pronounced? Thank you.
Thank you, Daphna. And may I please ask the speakers to keep the responses very brief, so we could let our attendees go and enjoy the rest of their evening or day, depending where they are. Thank you. Jessica, you're unmuted. Perhaps you can begin.
Sure. This is a perfect segue from Tamara's discussion about nurses to the next one. My mother is a nurse, 30 years as an RN. When she was in her 20s, she was in Los Angeles, right on the front lines of the riots in that city, saving lives. Right now, she's on the front line of the pandemic as a researcher in healthcare disparity. So I think, having experience with the medical system now as giving birth in Canada, and also comparing to the US, Canada can offer some lessons to the US. And I think in Ukraine, what we're gonna see now is more and more discussion about reproductive rights and different debates. That's a very heated issue with a lot of different opinions. But in the region of Poland too, that's happening right now. And with the pandemic, these questions around biopolitics are really going to take the forefront. But that doesn't mean that anything else should take a backseat. So less attention might be going towards the more mundane, like voter enfranchisement, which is so important for a post-revolutionary state like Ukraine. So those are my observations. Thank you, Dana, and I look forward to your book.
Excellent. Emily, may I invite you?
Yeah, thanks, Daphna, for the question. Thanks for coming. And I want to actually combine this with Oksana Duchuk's question that asked me to talk about the split and the ways they manifest now, kind of the split between what's imposed from the outside and what's in internal needs. Because I do think, Oksana, that you're right that, especially the Ukrainian feminist framing of labor issues as women's issues and as feminist issues, that's something that has been really prominent in Ukraine among, as a huge priority for Ukrainian women and Ukrainian feminists. Women in the US are just now starting to figure out that you don't have to be a Marxist to talk about wage inequality. And so I think actually there's a reverse kind of influence there. And I really hope that Ukrainian women and Ukrainian feminists will keep up, especially with pandemic. The results of women dropping out of the workforce in the pandemic, I think, is a huge issue. That's a global issue. Ukrainian women have established this amazing foundation for us to look at this issue. And then the other thing I think in terms of future trends is looking at how LGBT issues are going to be associated with or not in terms of feminism. Are they part of feminist activism? Are they their own sphere? Are feminists inherently allies of the LGBT movement? That's something, again, that's a global issue that is still being worked out. And I see different trends developing in Ukraine, and I really hope that inclusivity is going to be the future of the Ukrainian feminist movement.
And I have a dream to have protests like in Berlin, for example, or in US, in New York, larger, more inclusive, where you have like families, people of different age groups, different generations, they are coming, and we see, and it's inclusive as much as possible, and that it's really a normal issue to go to protest on International Women's Day, 8th of March.
Gosh, I think ending with a dream is the best possible way to end. And we all know that these kind of dreams do come true because, well, we make them come true. And I think the fact that we had over 100 people attend this discussion also serves as evidence that there's a lot of interest in the topic of women's activism. And I'd like to thank our excellent speakers, Tamara Martsenyuk, Jessica Zychowicz, and Emily Channell-Justice for participating in tonight's or today's discussion, and all of you for attending and for asking your questions. Hopefully we'll talk about something like that more often than once a year.